All right, let's grab our Bibles tonight. Turn to the book of Ruth, chapter number 2. And again, this story is taking place in the time of the Judges. It was a horrible time historically for God's people. And the Lord would send them a great leader. He would have a time of wonderful influence over the kingdom and over the lives of these people. And then as soon as he was taken off the scene, they fell into a time of backsliding, and God had to punish them. Chapter 2, beginning at verse number 1, the Bible there says, "And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, Let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, Go, my daughter. And she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and said unto the reapers, The Lord be with you. And they answered him, The Lord bless thee. Then said Boaz unto his servant that was set over the reapers, Whose damsel is this? And the servant that was set over the reapers answered and said, It is the Moabitish damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab. I want to bring a message this evening on the subject, When Love Begins to Wake. When our kids were growing up, I was putting in some long days here at the church. And so when I got home, I would try to, on purpose, create opportunities to spend time with the kids. And so anytime I needed to go to the store for something, I was usually throwing out the question, Who wants to go with Dad? And that's when they really had to think carefully about how they were going to answer this. The reason was because sometimes they were in the middle of a school project and they had to get that thing done for the next day. Or else it was summertime and they were wanting to go swimming. Or maybe they were getting ready for a teen activity that they needed to go to. And the reason that they really needed to think hard about how they were going to answer my question was because I always had an ace up my sleeve. And that was a saying that I used to use. You always come out ahead when you go with Dad. As they got up the idea of, boy, yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to go with Dad. That would usually, when they were younger, result in me buying their favorite candy bar. And that worked for a while. And then they got older, and I needed to take them through the drive-thru at McDonald's or down to Cone Palace and get them an ice cream cone. And that worked for a while. But then going with Dad to the store, it ended up with me taking them shopping and buying purses or shoes or clothes. And boy, I'll tell you what, it reached a time when they got to be teenagers, getting close to graduating, I would sneak out of the house, hoping that they didn't see Dad going to the store. There is a lesson that I wanted to teach my kids, and I wanted to burn that truth into their brains because it always works out better when you decide to go with Dad. This chapter is going to bring about the same truth in relation to Ruth and the Lord. Truth of the matter is, it's only the tip of the iceberg as it deals with one of the greatest romance stories in the Bible. And it all hinges upon one thing, and that one thing is trusting God and His providence. God knows how to take care of the details in our lives. Over the years, I've seen what happens when parents get involved and they decide to play Cupid with their kids. They find what they think is the ideal match for their child, and then they do everything that they humanly possibly can to help those two kids fall in love. And many times they end up getting what they want, only to later discover that God wasn't in it at all. And now there are two miserable, unhappy people who happen to be married to each other. I've also seen what happens when a young person gets in too big of a rush in wanting to get married. The first mistake is when they fall head over heels with that very first person who comes along and shows them any interest at all. And their first date turns into an engagement, then a marriage, when everybody around them is trying to talk some sense into them, encouraging them, you need to date other people first. But what do those happily married people know about love and marriage? And so the young person blows them off, gets married to their first date, only to discover years later that they should have listened to their parents and their pastor. I've also seen what happens when a person falls in love according to the ways of the world. They meet them in a worldly setting, like a bar. They date like the world. They act like the world. And they end up living together to see if they're compatible with each other. And then they get a wedding ring and decide to get back into church, only to discover that now they're married to somebody who's not spiritual at all, which is how they met him in a bar. And when one of them decides to get back into church, they realize that they're married to somebody who has no spiritual interest at all. Do any of those things sound a little bit familiar to what's going on nowadays? They should, because that's where most of the marital regrets and train wrecks come from. And that brings us to this chapter because it is a breath of fresh air. For it is a love story that takes place between two godly people who were willing to let God take care of the details in their lives. Ruth doesn't have to dress in a low-cut blouse and a tight short skirt to get somebody's attention. Boaz doesn't have to recommend to Ruth that she move in with him so that they can play house and have the benefits of being married without the commitment. In fact, it is so old-fashioned that it's refreshing. And the beauty of it all is that when God is allowed to put two people together, it not only works, but it results in a happy ending. So let's take a look at the hand of God that is moving about in this wonderful, great love story. Verse number 1, if you'll circle the name Boaz, our first observation tonight is this: love must learn to wait. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth, of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. The first thing that we need to keep in mind is this divine romance does not have young people in it. For Boaz and Ruth, neither one would qualify as a spring chick. Ruth had already been married for 10 years. Her husband had already died. She's not a teenager who just graduated from high school, nor is she a young woman in her 20s. More than likely, Ruth is in her 30s because she had no children. She now has no husband, and more than likely, she's probably given up all hope of ever being a mother. But she seems to be content, even though she is a widow trying to start a new life. There appears to be nothing on the horizon as far as her hoping to find a man. What I see about Ruth is she's not desperate. She is in love with the Lord. She's made a commitment to Him. And she seems to be happy with her lot in life. Boaz seems to be older than her. He is already a successful man who is wealthy with lots of land. He's probably the most eligible bachelor in the entire region. But there's something admirable about him as well. For he too seems to be in no hurry to find the right woman for him. He's working on his farm. He's kind to his workers, but he's in no hurry. If he's in his 40s at this point in time, then consider this. He's been an eligible bachelor for more than 20 years. And he seems to be content with his life as well. And so the first thing that we see about these two people who will eventually fall in love is that neither one of them is desperate, neither one is in a hurry. And because of that, God is able to handle things His way without running into any interference on either side by either one of these individuals. Verse number 1 again. This time circle the word wealth. And the second thing that we find is that love must stand on its own 2 feet. Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth, of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. Something else that we find of significance given to us by the Holy Spirit is that Boaz had money. He was a man of wealth. So what exactly does that mean? In today's society, it means a lot. It means that he wasn't living with his parents and playing video games all day instead of getting a job. It means he wasn't a teenager and had to borrow money to spend on a date. It means that he wasn't on welfare and therefore he could take care of a family and a wife. What it means is that he was a mature adult who had already found a lifelong career for himself. And why is that important before starting to date or trying to find that spouse that he could live the rest of his life with? The reason it's significant is because there is a worldly way of doing things, and then there's also a Bible way. I want to give you this verse. Mark your spot right there. This is an easy verse to find. You need to have it marked because this is a great Bible principle having to do with giving advice to young people. Proverbs chapter 24, verse 27. Great Bible principle here. Proverbs 24, verse 27. Here is the advice coming from the wisest man in the world. And the advice is this: prepare thy work without, and make it fit for thyself in the field, and afterwards build thine house. The advice is, you better find a career before you worry about finding a spouse. You better make sure that you can take care of that wife before you dare take her out from underneath the roof of her parents. It's not fair to that woman. It's not fair to mom and dad. If you cannot afford to get married and take proper care of that wife, don't even think about taking her out on a date. Because dating exists for one reason. It's not to have fun. It's to find, is this God's will for my life? You find a career first, then you find a spouse. This is why teenagers have no business dating. This is why college students need to hit the books hard their first year in college, not starting to date until perhaps their second year of college. This is why college students should not get married until after they finish college and have a steady job. The idea is it's hard enough to have a great marriage. So why not avoid financial problems and all of the negative drama that goes along with it? Be financially secure before you look at getting married. verse number 2. Third thing tonight is this. Observation number 3, love, the real love submits. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, circle these next 2 words, let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, go, my daughter. This is such a refreshing thing to see in Ruth. She's a full-grown woman. She's already been married. And yet, because she's living under Naomi's roof, she's asking her mother-in-law for permission to go out and find food for themselves. She's new here. She didn't know what the rules in this country were yet. She didn't want to say or do anything in this new land that might hurt Naomi or make him look bad. And so, using some common sense, Ruth is first asking permission before making her first impression with this new set of neighbors. Well, why is that such a big deal? Because there is a difference between real love and the cheap imitation that the world is trying to pawn off on us. When a young person falls in love with somebody, and that other somebody robs mom and dad of their influence, that is nothing more than worldly love. Worldly love competes and destroys all of its competition. Worldly love uses worldly tactics to entice, like immodesty and rebellion. Real love, however, never loses sight of the Lord and wants to honor Him in all of its behavior, like godly submission. If a person wants to find out what their dream boat is really like, all they have to do is take a good look at how Dreamboat treats their parents. If Ruth was willing to submit herself to Naomi, that was a pretty good indication. When the day comes and Ruth gets married, she's going to be willing to do the same thing to her husband. The reason is because people tend to put a mask on and pretend to be who they're not, so as to impress somebody that they're wanting to get close to. But when family is all that there is, there's no need to wear the mask. What you see is what you get. Now here's another element that shows just how much God is impressed when a person is willing to submit to leadership. Naomi wasn't even spiritual at this time. And yet Ruth is still willing to submit to this unspiritual person that she's now tied herself to. Naomi was still bitter and mad at God. And yet Ruth is going to be blessed for submitting to Naomi, even though Naomi was not a very good role model at this point in her life. Verse number 3, this time circle the word gleaned as we come to it. Observation number 4 tonight is this: love is a reflection. And she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. As soon as Ruth and Naomi moved back to Judah, Ruth is seen wanting to go out and to get busy doing something that's called gleaning. More than likely, Naomi had already started teaching her about some of these Jewish customs that Ruth had never heard of before. And gleaning was one of those nice to know, I hope we never have to do this kind of information. Anybody familiar with the Bible knows that God has always had a soft spot in his heart for people who were poor. In Bible times, poverty was not so much a reflection of a person's character as much as it was that they were a victim of circumstances. I think it's always an amazing thing to read how so many of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, so many of them died in poverty. The reason that they were chosen was because when it was time to sign their name and to take a public stand against the British, they were chosen because they were people of influence and affluence. They were landowners, ship owners. They were men of means. And yet because they attached their name to the Declaration of Independence, many of them had to pay dearly for their patriotic stand. Many lost their wealth, their health, and their lands and homes. The same kind of situation existed in Bible times. Just look at Job and you see that he lost everything. It wasn't a lack of character on his part. It wasn't because he was not willing to go out and look for a job. It's not that he was satisfied living on welfare. It was because he was a godly man. And Satan wanted to sift him. Allowed by God to see what he was made of. And Job lost everything. Because of the uncertainty of the times during this time frame, God made a provision, especially to help widows and orphans. And his safety net was called gleaning. In Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 9, gleaning is touched upon and described. And there it says, "And when ye reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. And thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of thy vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and stranger. I am the Lord your God." Listen again to the description of what these farmers were to do. God instructed them, when you're sending your workers through the field, make sure that they don't harvest the corners of the field. Why the corners? Because they were so easy to find. God wanted it to be easy for the widows and for the orphans to find and to gather that food. They didn't have to walk through acres and acres and acres trying to find some food on the ground or still on the stalk. They knew exactly where to go. Let's just go to the corners. Because if this is a good, obedient Jew, he left the corners just for us. God here instructed his people to leave behind on purpose food that was going to be reserved for a special class of people. When Ruth learned of God's provision for the poor and the stranger, she chose to take advantage of this law that probably only existed in Israel. And it was only a law because of God's love for poor people. Before she ever left Moab, Ruth had already decided to give her heart to God. Before she ever left, she looked Naomi in the eye and said, "Your God is now my God." When she arrived in Israel, there she saw firsthand just how much God loved His people, especially those who were poor, and even more especially those who were widows, just like her. And this is such an important thing to understand about love. In 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 4, it says, "Charity or love suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, that rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Charity never faileth." Does it not sound as if this passage is really describing the Lord Himself? The bottom line here is that the real kind of love is nothing more than a reflection of Jesus Christ and how He loves us. Verse number 3 again. This time circle the word hap as we come to it. Observation number 5. God uses appointments, not accidents. God deals with appointments, not happenstance, not coincidence, not good luck, appointments. "And she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech." Now, in reading this verse, it sounds like I just contradicted what it says. And we're going to kind of call a timeout here. We're going to kind of go on a deliberate rabbit trail and conduct a Bible study so that you can understand how God wrote the Bible. He wrote it in as few words as necessary so that we could better know Him. And for that to take place, God sometimes wrote things not as they really are, but as they appear to be from our vantage point. And again, the idea is, He didn't write it to reveal everything that He knows. He wrote what He knows, and He put it in a context where we could understand it. For example, don't want you to turn there. I'll read the verse to you. But in Isaiah chapter 45, verse number 6, the Bible talks about the sun rising. That verse says, "That they may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none beside me. I am the Lord, and there is none else." The important thing in that verse is what it ends with when God says, "I am the Lord, and there is none else." He did not write that verse to explain to you and I the rotation of the earth around the sun. The verse was given to us so that we could grab hold of the main truth, which is, "I am the Lord, there is none else." Because of that verse, Galileo got into a whole bunch of trouble with the Catholic Church hundreds of years ago because he came up with this idea that the sun doesn't revolve around the earth like everybody thought, but the earth actually travels around the sun, which it does. But the Catholic Church treated him like a heretic because his view contradicted that verse. But if it's not true, then why did God say that the sun rises? The reason is because God wasn't writing a textbook on science or astronomy. He was wording things so that you and I could understand it. And from our vantage point, early in the morning, at sunrise, you can see the sun coming up over the horizon. But you know what? The sun's not coming up. The earth is what's traveling. It has the appearance to us that the sun is rising. Galileo discovered that's not so. And you know what? The Bible is not contradicting anything. God is simply sparing His words, and instead of trying to teach us about astronomy, He's making it easy for people in Bible times, as well as right now, to understand the main thrust of what He's saying. And the main thrust is, I am the Lord, and there is none else. Another example of how God is not really being accurate as much as He's trying to help us poor dumb sheep down here to understand Him, is how He refers to Himself almost as if He was a human when He's not. Now let me ask you this. Does God really know everything? Well, sure He does. Well, then why was it when He was in the Garden of Eden and Adam messed up and God is heard shouting out, "Where art thou? Adam, where art thou?" I thought God knew everything. Well, He does. Then why is He asking Adam where he is? The reason was to convict Adam. The day before, God would show up in the cool of the day, the Bible says. And then God and Adam would spend some sweet time together. But on this particular day, God showed up and Adam was not there to greet him. And I have a sneaky suspicion that God already knew what had happened. A preacher, why do you think that? Because God knows everything. He was asking a rhetorical question meant to bring conviction into Adam's heart. Is God all-powerful? Well, sure He is. Then why did He create the universe and the earth, and then after He got done, He rested? But He did. He didn't rest because He was tired. He rested to show that He was finished. Nothing else to do. When it was time to remove His people from Egypt, God told Moses that He was now going to stretch out His hand over the whole land of Egypt. But wait a minute. Doesn't the Bible tell us that God is a spirit? Well, yes, it does. Well, if He's a spirit, then He doesn't have hands. So why would He refer to Himself as having hands or changing his mind or walking here or there, why would he speak to us as if he was a human when he's not? The reason is because we are just poor, dumb, finite sheep down here, and God is an infinite being, and he's using as few words as possible in this book to teach us about himself. It's not that he's contradicting truth. It's not that he's lying. He's taking into account that we have a hard time understanding him as it is. So what happened when Ruth decided to go out and glean in order to get some food for herself and Naomi? The word hap in verse 3 means it was Ruth's good fortune for her to accidentally end up in the field of Boaz. Now, is that really true? To Ruth, it sure was. To Ruth, wow, I am so lucky. To Ruth, I am so fortunate. But why did she think that this was an accident? The reason was because that's how new Christians think. But for those of us who know how God works, we can better understand that it was not an accident at all. Instead, it was one of God's divine appointments. And so the Holy Spirit chose to describe this chance meeting in the way that Ruth would have looked at it from her vantage point. And yet God works in strange and mysterious ways in what we call accidents, or good fortune, or good luck. It's really nothing more than God's grace revealing itself so that one day we can see his hand moving constantly in our lives. Verse number 4. This time, circle the word Bethlehem. Observation number 6, last one tonight, is this: there is more to God's will than meets the eye. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said unto the reapers, The Lord be with you. And they answered him, The Lord bless thee. When we think of God's will, we almost always think of the what? That which we're supposed to do. What is God's will for my life? We're spring-loaded to think it's something that we're supposed to do. Over a period of time, we get to learn and discover more of the Bible. And then we come upon the discovery that it's not just what God wants us to do, but it also involves when we're supposed to do it. A timetable belonging to God. And that's when we discover that a person can get ahead of God and they can actually do the right thing, but it's done at the wrong time. But a good example of this is when Moses was 40 years old. He was next in line to be the Pharaoh of Egypt. He knew in his heart that he was going to be somehow used by God to be the deliverer of his people. I mean, who else was there? He looked at himself and saw that he was the logical choice. And so one day he presented himself to these Hebrew children as the deliverer. It was the right thing, but it was at the wrong time. And because he got ahead of God, he ended up making a huge, huge blunder. He ended up killing an Egyptian, having to disappear for 40 years simply because it was the right job. But the timing was wrong. Well, what else could there be then that would be a part of God's will? The what? and the when, but God also has a where that He's very fond of. God is particular not just about what we're supposed to do and when it's to be done, but also where we're supposed to be when we do it. Where did Boaz live? Bethlehem. Why even mention it? I mean, God is not going to use a whole bunch of words. He's going to condense them. He's going to pick His words very carefully. Why bother telling us that Boaz was from Bethlehem? The reason is because he will one day get married. He and Ruth will one day have a son. And their son would become the father of King David. And King David would have a son. And that son would have a son. And that son would have a son. And on and on. And then many years later, Joseph and Mary would be forced to return to Bethlehem because of a census being taken that required them to go back to the place where their family was from. Boaz was about to fall in love with a godly and gorgeous woman. But what God is wanting us to know is that just because he fell in love, he never left the place where God had put him. And please understand, there's nothing wrong with moving from one place to the next as long as God is the one doing the moving. My family and I moved here 30 years ago. And we believed that God was the one who was doing the moving. And God has blessed us tonight with a great staff, and the reason is because God led them here also. And we have a great group of people here tonight in this church because God led you here as well. And so please understand that God is in the moving business. But once he moves a person to a place in his will, he then expects us to put spiritual roots down and to remain in that place where God has planted us until he decides it's time to move someplace else. And sometimes it's to a new location here on earth, but most of the time he just moves us on to heaven. For Boaz, he was already where he was supposed to be. And after he fell in love, to his credit, he stayed where he was supposed to be. And that decision then rippled through time until a baby was born in a manger in Bethlehem. And it was all because a good man met a good woman, and they both chose to remain in God's will for the rest of their lives. Let's bow for prayer. Father, would you bless each and every person here this evening? And Holy Spirit, I pray and ask that you would please allow us to grab hold of that idea, that concept of what real love is all about. There is a worldly kind of love that brings about heartache and ruin and loss. And then there is another kind of love that is forgiving and gentle and kind. And it is that love that you have given to us, and you're asking that we would then love you back likewise. Our heads are bowed and our eyes are closed.